Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today I thought it'd be interesting to look at who are my most read authors and how many books have I read from these top 10 most read authors. I even thought I could potentially try to rank all of the books that I've read from them from my favorite to least favorite, but I feel like that's going to be a really difficult thing for me to do. But we will see. I wasn't surprised really by who these authors were. I had a very clear idea in my mind before actually looking into it of who are my most read authors, but I found it extremely interesting to see how many books I read from each of these authors. So I thought I would start out with the authors that I've read the least from of the most, and then I'll go up to the author I've read the most books from. There are 3 authors that I have read 6 books from each, so they're in no particular order. I've actually just read 6 books from each of them. The first author is Kazuo Ishiguro, who I adore. He is one of my favorite contemporary writers, which I'm going to be saying this about each and every one of the writers that I mention in this video. Of course they're my favorites because I've read multiple books from them. So I have read 6 books from Ishiguro. Those are Never Let Me Go, which is definitely my favorite, Clara and the Sun, The Remains of the Day, The Buried Giant, a short story collection called Come Rain or Come Shine, and a collection of lyrics that he just released called The Summer We Crossed Europe in the Rain. I love his writing. I think he's such a fantastic author. What I love so much about his stories is they're all very different, but they have similar themes. They have themes about the human condition, humanity, love. He asks a lot of questions and he makes the reader think very deeply, and that's what I really love about his narratives. And he just captures so much emotion, so much depth in his novels, and that is why he's one of my favorite writers and why I am currently in the middle of reading all of his works, so I highly recommend you check him out if you haven't read any Ishiguro books. I always recommend everyone to read Never Let Me Go because it's my personal favorite, and I always say to read it without knowing anything beforehand. I think it's such an exciting story to learn about as you read and to go in not knowing anything about what to expect. So highly recommend Never Let Me Go and all of his work because I think he's just a fantastic writer and a writer that I think can attract a lot of different types of readers because his books are quite different in tone and subject matter. So yeah. The next author is of course another favorite, and that is Fyodor Dostoevsky. I am a big fan of Russian literature, and I have been reading a lot of Russian lit over the past couple of years. Really since 2021 I started my Russian lit journey, and Dostoevsky is one of the absolute greats. And the books that I have read from him, and I will try to rank them as best as I can. I'm not going to read them out in any particular order, but I will put them in order on the screen if I can. Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, White Nights, Notes from Underground, The Double, and Poor Folk. I think my favorite is probably White Nights. And I really also love The Brothers Karamazov and Notes from Underground. I also love Crime and Punishment, but I definitely need to do a reread. Why I love Dostoevsky so much is just, you have to read Dostoevsky and then you will also love him. A lot of his books are very harrowing and sorrowful, but he also captures so much beauty and honesty and hope in his narrative, but it's really kind of an underlying theme that when you look through the words and you look into the subtext, even just in the text, he captures and you can see so much hope and beauty and the way that he viewed the world. He had a very troubled life. He had a lot of terrible things happen to him and he grappled with a lot of illness, and I think that is reflective in his work, but I also think that he did still see the beauty in the world. And I just love his stories so much because they, like I said about Ishiguro, they're so deep and they make you think so deeply, and they're life-changing. I feel like if you read Dostoevsky, it will just completely change how you view the world and how you think about humanity and the human condition and your own emotions and justice and religion. And there are just so many themes in his novels that are universal, which is of course what makes his work classics. They've stood the test of time because the things that he writes about are timeless, and they will never not be relatable even though so many years have gone by, which is why his work is so unbelievable. So highly recommend checking out Dostoevsky if you haven't. I think a great introduction would be White Nights, which is a short story, and I find it very approachable. Highly recommend reading White Nights if you haven't read any Dostoevsky. He's just fantastic. The next author that I've also read 6 books from is one of my all-time favorites, and that is, of course, Jane Austen. Jane Austen is incredible. I can't say enough wonderful, beautiful, amazing things about Jane Austen. Her work is so important. She did so much for the literary landscape, and we are reading certain books today because of her novels. She just paved the way for literature in a way that very few writers have, or quite a few writers have, but Jane Austen, especially for women writers, just did so much. So the 6 books I have read from her, I have read all of her novels except Mansfield Park, but I will be reading Mansfield Park in May for my book club, the Well-Read Book Club, which you can join for free. There's a link in the description. We read together on Fable, and I am so excited but also so sad to have read all of Jane Austen's novels, but now I get to reread them whenever I want, which is beautiful. So the ones that I have read: Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Sense and Sensibility, Northanger Abbey, Persuasion, and The Beautiful Cassandra. The Beautiful Cassandra isn't a novel, but I'm counting it because it is a work by Jane Austen. My favorites are probably Pride and Prejudice, Emma, and Sense and Sensibility. Pride and Prejudice was my first Jane Austen, so it does have a very special place in my heart, but I equally love Emma and Sense and Sensibility. Her stories are about marriage and women's roles and sisterhood and the importance of a home to her characters. At this time, what's so interesting about her stories is we learn so much about that time period, and we have this very honest portrayal of what life was like, especially for women. If you haven't read any Jane Austen, I would maybe say start with Pride and Prejudice because it is one of the most iconic. The movie adaptation with Keira Knightley or the miniseries with Colin Firth, they're both fantastic, but I do think I prefer the 2005 movie better just because I love how beautiful and cinematic it is, and I do love how authentic the miniseries is to the book, but I love the cinematic beauty of the movie, and that is something I really gravitate towards. But anyway, highly recommend checking out Jane Austen if you haven't, and I would recommend maybe starting with Pride and Prejudice. The next author I have read 8 books from. He is one of my very favorites, of course. That's not a surprise, and that is Ernest Hemingway. I love Ernest Hemingway's books. I have read The Old Man and the Sea, A Farewell to Arms, The Sun Also Rises, For Whom the Bell Tolls, A Movable Feast, a short story collection called The Snows of Kilimanjaro, To Have and Have Not, and another collection of stories which are very early in his career in our time. My favorite fiction book of his has to be A Farewell to Arms, and my favorite nonfiction of his is A Movable Feast. He has so many incredible quotes about writing, and something that he talked a lot about was writing one true sentence, and then once you write one true sentence, write another true sentence and another true sentence, and that's how you capture life and humanity, and that's how you can write an honest book. And he doesn't mean that in terms of write nonfiction, like not to write a true sentence as in it's real, but he means true in terms of humanity and in terms of emotion. And that's what I love about his books. He doesn't sugarcoat anything. A lot of his writing is very succinct, and I think what's beautiful about his writing is the subtext. It's where the compassion and the lyricism and the beauty is. He's not trying to write something super poetic, but he does write things poetically just in his natural writing style. I find so much beauty in his very unsugar-coated, to-the-point, succinct writing, and I think it's honest. It captures his narrative voice so beautifully. I think he has a very distinct narrative voice, and that is something that I really love from authors. And yes, I think Hemingway's stories are fantastic, and I highly recommend them. Start with A Farewell to Arms if you want to read fiction, or A Movable Feast. I think starting with A Movable Feast, you get kind of an idea of what he was like as a person, because it's about his time in the 1920s in Paris, and if you love the movie Midnight in Paris, you will love A Movable Feast. So, of course, can't recommend Hemingway enough. The next 4 authors, I have read 10 books from each, and the first author is Lucy Maud Montgomery. She is the writer of the Anne of Green Gables series, so it will not be a surprise that all of these books are from the Anne series, but I have read other books from her as well that aren't in the Anne series. They are Anne of Green Gables, Anne of Avonlea, Anne of the Island, Anne of Windy Poplars, Anne's House of Dreams, Anne of Ingleside, Rainbow Valley, Rilla of Ingleside, which are all in the Anne series, and then these 2 books aren't in the Anne series. The first one is Emily of New Moon, which is the first book in a trilogy. I've only read the first one, and then one of my absolute favorites that I just recently read, it's a standalone novel called The Blue Castle. If I had to pick favorites, I would say Anne of Green Gables, Anne of the Island, and The Blue Castle are probably my top 3 favorites. Lucy Maud Montgomery is a Canadian author who is just, her writing, she captures the beauty of nature unlike any other writer. There are other writers that do capture nature beautifully, but she captures it in such a special, unique way that you can tell it's her writing. She writes a lot about family and finding yourself and coming of age and friendship and romance and all those beautiful things about life. Her stories and her characters are so lovable, and you can't help but getting so attached to the stories and to what you're reading about and to who you're reading about. And I think she's amazing. So if you haven't read the Anne of Green Gables series, oh my gosh, I cannot urge you to read the Anne series enough. If you have already read the Anne series and maybe you haven't read any of her other stories, she wrote so many books, which I need to read way more of them. I'm glad that I have read 10 already, but I highly recommend The Blue Castle if you haven't read it. If you love Jane Austen, if you love the character of Lizzie Bennet and Charlotte Lucas, you will love The Blue Castle because it has a lot of those similar vibes and themes of Pride and Prejudice, specifically Elizabeth Bennet and Charlotte Lucas. So I can't recommend Pride and Prejudice and The Blue Castle enough, and also just Ella Montgomery. She is such a wonderful writer, and she kind of feels like home. Like, reading her books feels like going home because they're so comforting and warm and beautiful, and you feel like you're just walking through a field when you read her books, and they're lovely and wonderful, and I can't recommend them enough, especially for this time of year. They're good for any time of year, but especially I would say spring and summer. The next author that I have read 10 books from is Charles Dickens. This will also not come as a surprise because I did have a book club with Emma where we read a lot of Dickens books, so that is why I have read a ton of Dickens. I do really love Dickens as a writer, but his earlier works I have realized that I don't love, and we were reading his works in chronological order, so we read a lot of his earlier work, and I feel like I will enjoy more of his later works, but I haven't read a Dickens in a very long time, and I feel like I need to. I feel like I want to approach his stories again. So the ones that I have read: Christmas Carol, Great Expectations, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, David Copperfield, The Pickwick Papers, The Old Curiosity Shop, Dombey and Son, Barnaby Rudge, and the short story The Great Winglebury Duel. My favorites are probably A Christmas Carol and Great Expectations. A Christmas Carol is so iconic. It's such a classic, and I know so many people love it. That's the book that I read to introduce myself to Dickens because I found him very intimidating for some reason. I mean, his books are very, very big. And then I read Great Expectations as my first novel, and it just swept me off of my feet, and I loved it. What I love about Dickens is how his characters feel so theatrical, and he makes the ordinary extraordinary. He puts life into everything, into the objects, into his books, especially into the characters. They just are so imaginative and whimsical and enchanting, even though it's his stories are set in realism, but he captures a lot of magic and whimsy. Although A Christmas Carol, I would say, isn't technically set in realism, though it is. It's more of more magical realism. I would recommend reading A Christmas Carol and Great Expectations if you haven't read any Dickens. Ones that I'm really looking forward to are A Tale of Two Cities and maybe Little Dorrit. I am quite interested in reading Little Dorrit as well. There are quite a few that I still haven't read, but I have A Tale of Two Cities on my shelves, and I would like to get to it at some point soon. The next author that I have read 10 books from is the man, the myth, the legend, Leo Tolstoy. The book club that I just mentioned that we read Dickens with, Emma and I read Dickens, we read also Tolstoy because the book club was Dickens versus Tolstoy, where we compared and contrasted the work of those writers. And so we read a lot of Dickens and a lot of Tolstoy. And the 10 Tolstoy books I have read, I just have to say that he is one of my all-time favorite writers. He's the reason why I started my whole Russian literature journey, and Anna Karenina is my favorite book. So I will just tell you that right now. The 10 books that I've read from him are How Much Land Does a Man Need and What Men Live By, which are 2 short stories. Then Anna Karenina, War and Peace, Resurrection, Family Happiness, Childhood, Boyhood, Youth, A Prisoner of the Caucasus, Polykushka, and The Cossacks and Other Stories. My 2 favorites, unsurprisingly, are Anna Karenina and War and Peace. What I want to tell you about Tolstoy is that there is no need to be intimidated by his writing. I find it one of the most approachable books ever, and I feel like so many people would laugh because it's a huge translated from the Russian story, and I feel like with that, it's very intimidating. And I thought that it was very intimidating before I started reading it, and then once I started reading it, I realized how approachable it was and how readable it was and how beautiful it was. What I love about Tolstoy is he captures everything, every human emotion, everything that a person can go through. He captures that in his books, and he just captures the world at large in his stories. His books are genuinely life-changing, and I can't recommend them enough. I highly recommend starting with Anna Karenina because it's unbelievably beautiful. I just don't have enough good things to say about it. Genuinely, when I love someone's writing and when I love someone's story so much, I have a hard time explaining why, and I feel like that's happening to me right now. So I just recommend him with my whole heart. The next author and the last author that I have read 10 books from is again not surprising, and that is Fredrik Backman. Fredrik Backman is an incredible Swedish author, and he has written quite a few books now. I have read all of them, except for his most recent short story, which was The Answer is No, I think. I haven't read that one, and he's coming out with a new book this year called My Friends, and of course I haven't read that one yet. But the books that I have read from him in no particular order are A Man Called Uwe, Beartown, Us Against You, and The Winners. Those 3 books are in a series, the Beartown books. Then we have My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry, Brit Marie Was Here, Anxious People, and then the 2 novellas, And Every Morning the Way Home Gets Longer and Longer, and the second novella is The Deal of a Lifetime. Then I also read his nonfiction book, which is actually kept in the parenting section. It is called Things My Son Needs to Know About the World. And I love all of his books so much. It's going to be so hard to rank these. My favorites have to be A Man Called Uwe and probably the Beartown series and Every Morning the Way Home Gets Longer and Longer. That's one of my favorite books, and it's a beautiful novella about memory loss. What I love about Fredrik Backman's books is they will make you laugh, cry, scream, shout, dance, jump up and down with joy. Like, he just will make you feel everything that you are capable of feeling. Like Kazuo Ishiguro, a lot of Fredrik Backman's books are quite different from one another, but they have very similar underlying themes, which are very common in literary fiction, like coming of age, family, friendship, love, grief, death, and I think he just captures the human condition like so many of these other writers. He captures humanity and emotion in such an authentic way, and And again, like I said about Lucy Maud Montgomery, even Leo Tolstoy, all of these writers, it feels like coming home when I read their books. I think because I've read so many of their books, I am familiar with the writing style, I'm familiar with the types of stories that they write, and I feel comforted and I feel like I'm returning to an old friend. And that's how it feels when I read a Backman book, and I can't recommend them enough. I highly recommend starting with A Man Called Uwe, but all of his books are fantastic. You really can't go wrong with starting with any of them. The second to last author that I have read the most books from, I have read 11 of their works, and they are not a novelist. They are a playwright, and that is William Shakespeare. I have read 11 Shakespeare plays, and they are Romeo and Juliet, The Taming of the Shrew, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, As You Like It, Macbeth, Much Ado About Nothing, Julius Caesar, and Twelfth Night. If I have to pick a favorite, I would say Romeo and Juliet, because it's the first Shakespeare play that I ever read in high school, and I love it so much. My all-time favorite is probably A Midsummer Night's Dream and Hamlet. I also love Macbeth as well. Those are very hard to choose from. My favorite comedy is for sure A Midsummer Night's Dream, and my favorite tragedy is probably Hamlet. He shaped the literary landscape like Jane Austen, but in a very different way, and he is amazing. What do I say about Shakespeare? It's Shakespeare. His plays are iconic, his scenes are iconic, the dialogue, the lines are iconic. I recommend watching the stage adaptations if you decide to read his plays, because they were of course meant to be seen and not just read, because it's so different to see a play visually, because there isn't description, it's just dialogue. But what I love about Shakespeare as well is even in the dialogue you can get a sense of atmosphere and tone. I of course highly recommend checking out Shakespeare if you haven't, and if you have, I would love to know what your favorite Shakespeare play is. If you've read, I should have said this at the beginning of the video, if you have read any of these authors, I would love to know what your favorites of them are, or maybe what your most read authors are. I would be interested. Okay, we have made it to the end. It is the final author. I have read the most books from this author, and she has been in my life since I was a child. And she is one of my all-time favorite writers. She has shaped my life in so many different ways. I am in the process of writing my own novel right now, and she is one of my greatest inspirations and has made me the writer, the aspiring writer that I am today because of her work. And that is Kate DiCamillo. I have read 13 of her books. She is an incredible middle grade and children's author, and something that I always say, and I will shout from the rooftops for the rest of my life, that middle grade books are not just for middle grade readers. I think that there are so many middle grade stories that should be read by adults. They should be read by people of all ages, because their messages are universal and they're ageless. So much of Kate DiCamillo's work, I think, is so deep and thoughtful, and she captures quite a bit of sorrow, but also she always talks about, in the millions of interviews that I've watched of her, that her job for writing for a younger audience is to instill hope. And so even though a lot of her stories capture sorrow and sadness, there is always hope at the end of the day. And I think that her work is some of the most heartfelt, life-changing, deep, thoughtful stories I've ever read, and I just can't recommend her work enough. So, the 13 books of hers that I have read are her first book, Because of Winn-Dixie, which is such an iconic story, and if you have grown up in the late 90s, early 2000s, you've probably read Because of Winn-Dixie when you were a child. Then we have The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane, The Tale of Despereaux, Flora and Ulysses, The Tiger Rising, The Magician's Elephant, Raimy Nightingale, Louisiana's Way Home, Beverly Right Here, The Beatrice Prophecy, The Puppets of Spellhorst, Ferris, and The Hotel Balzar. It is going to be nearly impossible for me to rank these. My favorites are probably Because of Winn-Dixie, The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane, The Tale of Despereaux, and maybe The Puppets of Spellhorst and the Hotel Balzar, and The Beatrice Prophecy. I love all of her books so much. I think the ones that have influenced my life the most are the ones that I read as a child, which are Because of Winn-Dixie, The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane, and The Tale of Despereaux. It makes me sad when I think about all of the adults that think that they're too old to read middle grade, because when you look at stories like Little Women and Anne of Green Gables, and The Secret Garden, and The Little Prince, and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and A Wrinkle in Time. Those are all books that were written geared towards a younger audience, but they're classics, they're read by adults, and I think that more modern middle grade should be read by adults. And I just think that they capture humanity in such an honest way, because when you're writing for a younger audience, your job is to introduce them to certain aspects of the world. And I think the most special thing about middle grade literature is that it captures life in an honest, beautiful, and comforting way. But it doesn't shy away from the harder topics as well. And it really just shows you life in a unique perspective. And it makes you remember your youth, because I think the older we get, the more further away from our youth we get, and I think the more important it is to honor the child in us and to nurture the child in us. And one way that you can do that is reading middle grade literature, or reading the stories that were important to you as a child, because the books that we read as children have shaped us to who we are today. And I think it's so important to return to those stories and to also continue to be shaped by literature for the young, because literature for the young is all about shaping them and showing them a world that is honest but also hopeful. And can you tell I love middle grade literature a lot, and I love Kate DiCamillo's work a lot. She is such a wonderful writer. She's such a wonderful person. I want to be her best friend. Every time I watch a video of hers, an interview when she talks about her writing, she is so down to earth and humble and wonderful, and just the way that she puts words together, the way that she speaks, oh my gosh, I can't take it. It's just amazing and beautiful. And her stories, they're all very different, but they all have the same whimsy and beautiful charm and hope and beauty, and I just love them so much. I can't say enough good things about Kate DiCamillo's work, which is why she's my most read author. I'm surprised and I'm not surprised that she's my most read author, and I can't believe I've actually read 13 of them, because I've never counted how many books of all of these authors that I've read, so that's why I was excited to do this video. But anyway, I think that is all that I'm going to say. I could keep rambling, because when I talk about the authors that I love so much, I could talk about them for ages. Like I said earlier, I would love to know who your most read authors are, if you have figured that out or kept tally of that. Now I have it in a note in my phone, and I'm going to keep adding on to this list of all the different books, and I'm going to keep adding more books to these authors as I read through all of their literature and all of the things that they have written. But I would love to know who your favorite authors are, which authors you have read the most from, and if you've read any of these authors, which stories have you read from them? What do you think of them? I would just love to hear what you have to say about everything that I have said, because I love hearing from you guys. But anyway, I have rambled on for a very long time. Thank you so much for watching. If you have reached the end, I love you and I appreciate you. And I hope that you enjoyed this video and you found it interesting, and maybe you got a new recommendation. So I will see you very soon in another video. I hope you're having a wonderful, wonderful day. And as always, happy reading.